Next, I want to talk to you about the graded passages. They're also referred to as word recognition and context. Now, you will see that the where to begin the graded passages, that would be at least one grade level below the highest independent level of the word lists. So if your reader read up to the sixth grade word list, and that was their, sixth grade was their frustration, back down to fifth grade was instructional, fourth grade was independent, third grade was independent. So let me write this out. So sixth was frustration, fifth was instructional, fourth was independent, third was independent, and you have to go, these are the word lists, words in isolation. You have to determine where to start the graded passages. So we're going to say one level below the highest independent level. Where was the student's highest independent level? Right there, grade 4. So we have to go down to grade 3, and that's where we will start the reading passages with this particular student. Now, notice it says at least. That means if you think that they need to do a lower level passage, that's okay too. This is just a general guideline. It's not always, the answer for every student. So for the procedures, you're going to cover the passage with a piece of paper. You're going to have the student, you just tell them what the title is, have the student read the title. You don't have to evaluate background knowledge. That's in an older version. You're going to ask the student, tell the student, I'm going to ask you some questions at the end of this passage. And then your job is to record the miscues on the protocol sheet while the student reads. Now, I'm going to show you here what that looks like while Elise reads a passage.
Now I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read the passage.
The busy bees had been making honey all day. That night it was cool and damp. I had slept well until I heard a loud noise in my window, near my window. It sounded like as if someone were trying to break into my cabin. As I moved from my cot, I could see something black standing near the window. In fright, I knocked on the window very slowly and quietly. The great shadow moved back and went away. The next day, we found a huge bear track. The bear had come for honey the bees were making in the attic of the cabin.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to point out in this section, this segment, that when she was reading, there was a spot where she ignored the punctuation. We talked about that last week. She said the bear was, let's see, go back. Here we go. She said, very quiet, very slowly and quietly, the great shadow moved back. No, sorry. Sorry about that. She said, I knocked on the window very slowly and quietly. So she actually put a period right here. And then she started, the great shadow moved back and went away. So the reader said, in fright, I knocked on the window very slowly and quietly. Well, in actuality, the text is saying very slowly and quietly, the great shadow moved, not knocking on the window. If you're knocking on the window in fright, you're not going to do that very slowly and quietly. So she completely changed the meaning of the text by ignoring, putting punctuation in here and then starting here. The great shadow moved back and went away. So she's changing the whole story by ignoring the punctuation or phrasing it in a way where punctuation doesn't exist. So if I were recording this, I would put the period right here because I would know that prior to that she had phrased that as a sentence. So that's a little bit about the recording of the passages. And so let's look at page 33. Let me pull that up. And this is the sample page that I gave you. It is not Elise's scoring, but if you want to practice with Elise and then send me a picture of it, I'll let you know if I agree. You know how to do all of the conventions. You know how to do the self-correct. You know how to do the repeats. You know how to do all of that. Now, notice only this side is filled out because we'll analyze later on this side, which you also know how to do because we did that last week with the running record. So, looking carefully at this, this reader said it was the first time Bob went to camp. Here's something to know about names. If he says Bob throughout the whole text instead of Bill, we're only going to count it once. There's a lot of people who don't even think you should count names wrong at all, especially when it's a name that readers have never even heard of. I have some books where the name is Keb or Nan, and even though it's a simple CVC word, they can't get it because they just have never heard of that, and they don't know anyone with that name. So you only count it at -1. Another thing, if they skip a whole line, that is also a -1 because, but hopefully they won't do that. So Bob for Bill was a substitution, so you mark 1 substitution. He was very happy to be there, so he went for a walk in the woods to look for many kinds of leaves. So he said so for soon, which is also a substitution. He found leaves from some maple trees and oak trees. So the examiner put 1 for an insertion. As Bill walked in the woods, he was some animal tracks. That's what we call a reversal. And there are certain words like was for saw that we are going to see. Sometimes our readers will read a reversal. And so we counted it there as a reversal. And this side, everything counts as an error, you will see. And then he said, at that minute, a mouse ran into a small hole by a tree, versus at that moment. So that is also a substitution. The examiner totaled it up so you can see 3 substitutions, 1 insertion, 1 reversal. That gave 5 total miscues. Now, you have to know this total in order to know if you're going to go on or not. Right away after the student reads it, though, you're going to flip the page and ask the comprehension questions. And we'll talk about that in a minute, and we'll watch Elise. And you'll be interested to see how Elise's comprehension worked out after that choppy version of what she read. But later, you can come back and do this analysis. First of all, I don't see any repeats, so I would not be putting a check and a repetition. I also don't see any self-corrections, unfortunately, so I wouldn't put not check marks, we'd put a 1. I wouldn't put any 1s in this column. But what about meaning change? Let's look at each error and see, is there meaning change? Well, they said Bob for Bill. I wouldn't count that as a meaning change just because it's a name. So for soon. So he went for a walk in the woods. Soon he went for a walk in the woods. There could be debate about whether or not that is meaning change. I think it's similar enough. I also think the structure of that sentence is a little tricky because how often do you start your sentence with soon? Soon I will go to the grocery store. We don't typically talk that way, but we sometimes see that in book talk. So I would probably not count that as a meaning change. He found leaves from some maple trees and oak trees. Did his insertion change the meaning? No. As Bill walked in the woods, he was some animal tracks. Does that work for you? No. So we would put a meaning change here for, not here, here for was for saw, because he was not the animal tracks. He saw them. And unfortunately, he wasn't listening enough to see that that sounds ridiculous and that that is not at all what the text is saying, because it's impossible for him to be an animal track. Or her. And then finally, at that minute, a mouse ran into a small hole by a tree. Minute, moment, I think those work carefully, similarly enough, so I would not put anything there. So down here, I would only have a one significant miscue. And I want you to take a look at the scoring guide at the bottom. Here we have independent, instructional, independent frustration. This is where I was talking about that we're going to go with the high end. If your reader has 2 to 4, you're going to call that independent. If your reader has 6 to 9, we're going to call that instructional. We're not going to use this second half. It's just letting you know you're getting close to that level. Now, when you look over here, there's 2 sides, the total miscues and the significant miscues. And remember, the significant miscues are the ones that change the meaning. So let's say your reader had 11 total miscues, but only 1 significant miscue. And several of them were self-corrections and that kind of thing. So you can go over here and see 10 as frustration, but when you go up here to 1, that's still considered independent when you look at the significant miscues. I typically say go by the total miscues. However, there are times when I will go with the significant because I feel like they had a lot of self-corrections, because even though they self-correct, it counts as an initial miscue, but it won't count as a significant miscue. So the self-corrections will count under the total. So if you feel like the reader really was monitoring and correcting appropriately and was really getting some meaning from that text, then you can keep going or call it independent. You could call it instructional. Either way, it's really also going to depend on how the comprehension goes. And so let's talk about that. And also, we will, there's a practice page I gave you a sample page that's blank, and I could do a practice on that a little bit later and put that up there for you to view as well. And so you can have a little more practice with doing this. If you have questions about the scoring, I'm not worried at all about your recording. I know you can do that from last week, and the words are right there. You just have to make sure you write what they say and record, so you know you can quickly determine how many total miscues. Because after you do this and you ask the comprehension questions, you have to quickly determine what is this overall level. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. So, assessing comprehension. There are a variety of ways to do that, and you'll see the one in bold is the one I want you to use. So, first of all, you could ask the comprehension questions, and I'll put my example up here. Here they are. And then, and also there's a retelling, and here's a spot for you to put your retelling notes. Then there's a concept of engagement. We're not going to use that concept of engagement, but we are going to use a combination of the retelling and the comprehension questions, and here's why. When you ask a reader to retell, you can really learn a lot about their comprehension and their language skills, their sense of story. And so, having them tell me what happened in this story, and then you just jot down what they say. Many times they're going to answer some of those comprehension questions, and that's great because then you don't have to ask those particular ones. But and they give you this retelling rubric, so you can go through here and decide from what they told you what their level is based on the retelling. And we talk about a retelling rubric at the end of the BRI to put into your summary and diagnosis section. that's your general, you're using this rubric at the end to generally say, how do they retell? How do they retell in everything that you've given them? That's when we're going to use this, and that's when you're going to talk about it in your summary and diagnosis. Now, for this, you can see that the examiner put a plus if the comprehension question was right, a minus if it was incorrect. And you can give half, and here's why. What kind of leaves did Bill find in the woods? The reader said maple. And then the examiner wrote, what else? And the reader said, I don't know. So you write down anything they say that differs from the text. You can see where the reader underlined or circled what the, you can see the examiner underlined or circled what the reader said. What else did Bill see besides the mouse? The reader said a bird nest and animal tracks. So they underline it. If they've already answered those questions in the retelling, you can just go through and put a plus and skip that question. Now, you might be wondering what those letters are off to the side of the questions. There's a T, an F, 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 I, E, and V. That's letting us know what type of question it is. For example, the first one is a topic question. What is this story about? The second one is F is for factual, and it's the lower level questions, and there are several of those. Then I is an inferential question. Do you think Bill went on this walk by himself? Yes or no? What makes you think so? So the reader has to pull information to find out if Bill went for a walk by himself or with someone else, and any logical response will work. And his answer was, yes, he didn't talk to anyone else, and that's very logical. What other animals, E is evaluate. What other animals might Bill see if he goes for another walk? Again, a logical response here. He said deer and squirrels, very possible. So that was correct. And then finally, V is vocab. What are deer tracks? And he said footprints made by an animal. And so that was a plus. Now, if there's a semicolon, like on number 5, what else did Bill see besides the mouse? A bird nest, semicolon, animal tracks. He only has to answer one, or the reader only has to answer one of those in order to get full credit. But if it says maple and oak leaves, then the reader has to say both to get a full point. And that's why on number 4, the reader only got half of a point. So you will see down at the bottom here that there's also a retelling, a comprehension scoring guide. There were 1.5 questions missed. Make sure you put the amount missed, not the number correct. Sometimes I mix those up and it really doesn't help you there. But the comprehension scoring guide, the overall comprehension is independent. Or again, we're not going to use the second piece of it. The reader only missed 1.5 questions. That means they had almost 85% accuracy in their comprehension, which is pretty good. And so on the first page, the reader was instructional. On the second page, the reader was independent for the comprehension. So we have 2 different scores. Now I have a page that I'm going to have that's available in Canvas that shows you if the word reading is independent or instructional and the comprehension isn't independent, like on this particular one, then the overall passage is going to be considered instructional. And it's because many times we're going to have maybe frustration on one and independent on the other, or instructional on one and frustration on another. And so we have to look at that as a combination to decide what that overall level is considered. And I'll try to give you some more examples of that, and I will talk about this on Wednesday night when we visit in person. So for this particular passage and comprehension questions, we would consider this overall level of instructional. Generally, if the comprehension is frustration, the passage overall is going to be frustration. We generally lean toward whatever the passage comprehension is going to have carry a little more weight as far as the overall level. Now, going back to the slides for the comprehension questions, there's the details here that I've already told you. Tell me what the story is about. You can do some probes. Just make sure you write down that you did that. Ask any remaining questions that the student didn't read. And then here's determining levels we already talked about that on the passages. And then keep in mind there might be some dialect. Only count once if they miss the same word over and over in the text. When I do a running record, if they say here for there 3 times, I give them 3 errors for that. But in this 100-word passage, we will only count it once against them as far as an error goes, and that will not skew their score terribly much for one word that they missed. So you're going to look at the scoring guides at the bottom of each scoring sheet based on number of errors, and then you're going to have to use some teacher judgment. Comprehension is going to weigh a little more than the word reading. Now, we're going to go and look at, well, where did Elise go? Okay, so now we're going to look at Elise, and these are the comprehension questions after that story that she just read about the hungry bear.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions. Elise, can you tell me what's this story about?
It's kind of about where the bees, they're sleeping and they hear like a loud noise and stuff. And one of the bees, they see the bear, and once they woke up, it was bear tracks outside the hive. And so after that, they kind of actually went back to work.
Okay. Can you tell me, what have the bees been doing?
They've been working all day trying to make honey.
Okay. Where were the bees making honey?
In the hive.
Okay.
Well, in the cat.
Who or what woke the person up in the story?
I think it was like a sound or something.
What was near the window?
The bee said like it was a shadow, but it was really a bear.
Okay. What was found the next day?
Bear tracks.
Mm-hmm. What did the bear want?
The honey.
Why do you think the bear walked away?
Probably because he saw the bear saw that the bee had woken up and was tapping on the window, so that's why he just walked away.
Okay. What might you do to keep the bear away?
Probably just like kind of ignore it, or probably just ignore it.
Okay. What is an attic?
Attic is it's like a high room, and it's a room, and it's like a room kind of at the near the top of the house. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a small room with like one window.
Okay. So, thank you.
So you will see that Elise was clearly not catching all of the information based on her read of the hungry bear. She completely missed who was telling the story. She thought the bees were telling the story because she had messed up, confused some punctuation, and had some choppiness to her reading. She also missed some other key points of the story. However, she did get several questions correct. And I can fill out a form for Hungry Bear for the reading passage and the comprehension and upload that for you. So if you want to try that using Elise, and then you can check that with my sample, that might be helpful for you as well. There's an additional passage that Elise reads. It's the 4th grade passage. So again, if you want to see that, you can do that at that grtep.com website. Another thing I want to talk to you about is the rate of reading. Now, I'm only going to have you time your reader once, just for practice to get the hang of it. You don't have to do this on every single passage, although that you certainly could. but I would try to time them on a passage that you think that they're probably going to do, you know, okay with, or instructional. It doesn't really matter. But you'll notice at the bottom of every page there is a little box that says oral reading rate and norm group percentile. And the formula at the bottom, they give you, it's 6,000, no, it's the number of the words times 60. Since all the passages are 100 words, or most of them, it's going to be 60 times 1,000 by the number of seconds. So if the reader read 80 something seconds, then you divide 6,000 by 80 and you'll come up with you know, I don't know, however many words per minute that is, based on the formula. And on the norms for the reading rate are on this page. They look like this, and that is page 43. And on that page, you'll go to the grade, and then you'll slide across to the number of words they read, and the percentile will be there for fall, winter, or spring. Right now we are in spring norms, so that's what you'll use. So for example, let's say your third grader read 35 words, and we would slide across words per minute for spring. That is well below the 10th percentile. Let's say your third grader read 75 words, slide all the way across, and you'll see that is close to the 25th percentile, which is still a little low, but a lot better than below the 10th percentile. There's some debate on whether or not you should use their grade level versus their instructional level. The student who's struggling, it's not going to make that much of a difference. They're going to still be below where they need to be, no matter what level. But when you report it, you might say, for the reading rate, you might say, the examiner assessed the student's reading rate on passage 8224, second grade reading level, where the student was considered instructional. And then you can say the rate was ... the norm says percentile, and then you can say this was based on the student's instructional level versus their grade level, because obviously if you're a third grader reading 10 words a minute for third grade words, I mean, if you're reading 40 words a minute in first grade words, you're going to read even less words with the third grade passage. So again, you can use either one for the rate, but just note it whenever you tell me about it in your summary, so that you have, so that I know that that rate is based on their grade level or their reading level. Either way is fine. So that's a little bit about the reading rate, and you can read more about that on page 43.